Have you ever been treated like trash? Inside the same house you built with your own hands, brick by brick, giving up yourself for love? And the worst part? It wasn't a stranger who did this to me. It was my own son. The one I raised alone, the one I carried in my arms when he had a fever, the one I withheld from him so he'd have something to pack in his lunchbox. One day, without warning, he looked me in the eye. Or rather, he didn't even look at me properly, and said quite naturally, "It'll be better for everyone if you stay away for a while." As if I were a burden in the way. As if I'd passed my expiration date. I stood in the middle of the room, unsure if it was serious or just a misunderstanding. But it was real. That room. That same room where I'd organized his birthday parties, where he'd learned to walk, where he'd slept on my lap watching cartoons, was now the scene of my own humiliation. It's hard to describe the feeling of being expelled from your own story. 'Cause that's what it is. When a child takes your home away from you, it's not just the roof that goes. It's the floor too. It's the memory. It's the identity. And the cruelest thing is that he made it seem like it was for my own good. That it was only for the duration of the renovation. "It'll be quick, Mom. It's just to make the work easier." I believed him. And you believe him too, because when we love we want to trust. But deep down, something inside me already knew. I just didn't want to see. Have you ever been there? Hearing sweet words mask bitter actions. Being abandoned not with screams, but with silence and coldness. Being a forgotten grandmother, a disposable mother, is a pain that corrodes you from within. I left that house with a small suitcase and a lump in my throat. I went to a small rented room in the back of an acquaintance's house, taking with me only my clothes, my medicine, and a question that kept coming back to me. At what point did my son stop seeing me as a mother? And the most painful thing is that no one saw it. No one knew. Because these things don't become a scandal. They don't make the news. They are subtle, silent acts of violence, hidden behind words like necessity, help, delicate moment. But they are real. They are open wounds in the hearts of many mothers and grandmothers who today live in oblivion, ignored by those they swore to love. Stories like these aren't often told, but mine needs to be heard. Because not all abandonment happens on the street. Sometimes it starts at the breakfast table, when your child stops asking how you are. When household decisions no longer fall to you. When the way you look at someone changes, and you realize you're now just a nuisance in the way. That's when I realized I hadn't just lost the house. I had lost my place in his heart. But what he didn't know is that I still had one last resort. Something he never imagined. Something quiet, discreet. But that would change everything. And that's when I decided to act. My name is Evelyn Grace. I'm 72 years old. And even though my voice bears scars today, it also holds stories. Stories no one ever wanted to hear, until the pain became impossible to silence. I was a full-time mother, my soul in pieces and my body in service. I raised my son, Daniel, alone. His father left us when he couldn't even walk. And I, without luxury, without a diploma, without anyone to hold my hand, fought. I washed clothes for others, cooked at the neighborhood school, cleaned other people's houses to have something to put on his plate. I never asked for applause. But I also never imagined that unconditional love could turn to indifference. Daniel was my treasure, my reason to get out of bed even when my body ached. Called him my miracle. He called me his queen. He wrote me little letters on Mother's Day, drew crooked hearts with crayons, and told me he'd take care of me when I got old. Sweet words, pure promises. That time took away. 'Cause something changed. And change, when it comes from the one you love most, doesn't come with noise. Comes with absences, with silences, with the disappearance of that sparkle in their eyes that once sought yours. I remember every detail of his childhood. The wrinkled uniform I ironed in the early hours. The lovingly wrapped lunch. The nights I stayed awake while he coughed incessantly. All of this seems small to the outsider. But to me, each gesture was a piece of my journey as a mother. A journey made of invisible sacrifices the kind no one sees, but which shape the soul. And I did it all without expecting anything in return. Perhaps just the bare minimum: respect. A place of affection. Place to grow old with dignity. But life sometimes confronts us with a hidden truth. Not every child knows how to recognize the love they've received. Daniel's transformation was subtle. First, there were the delays in visits. Then the curt responses to calls. Until one day he stopped answering. When he appeared again, he was no longer the sweet boy who hugged me tightly. He was a man in a hurry, with tired eyes and a coldness I never knew how to decipher. He said he was full of responsibilities, that life was busy, that I needed to understand. And I tried to understand. For years I tried. But behind all that rushing around, there was something I struggled to accept. I no longer fit into his life. What had once been home became a contested space. And that's how everything began to crumble. With soft words that hid cold decisions. With small gestures that carried a gigantic impact. It was as if I had become a nuisance. A reminder of the past he wanted to erase. It's strange how loneliness can grow even when surrounded by familiar walls. I saw myself inside that house, but it was as if I'd been erased from the emotional map. He remodeled the bathroom without consulting me. He moved the furniture around without telling me. And little by little I lost my voice. As if my story had been pushed into the shadows of the house itself. Until that day came. The day he uttered the phrase that still echoes in my mind. "It'll be better for everyone if you stay away for a while." And there I was, no longer the mother. I was the obstacle, the interference, the hindrance. But you know what no one expected? That behind this silent woman lay a hidden strength. A lucidity that no one could take away. A living memory that knew exactly what had been done to that family. I didn't need to scream to prove my truth. I just needed to act consciously. Only. With dignity. And that's when, little by little, my mindset began to change. Because there comes a time in life when pain no longer paralyzes, drives. And while he thought I was just accepting it, something inside me was already preparing. At first I didn't want to believe it. After Daniel got married, I noticed small, almost imperceptible changes, but together they began to create an unease that was hard to ignore. He no longer invited me to family meals. I heard the clatter of cutlery, the laughter coming from the dining room, and I waited for someone to call me. But the invitation never came. When I showed up on my own, I was greeted with a weak smile and a cold plate. I started eating alone in the corner of the kitchen, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just a phase. The house, once filled with affection and shared routines, grew increasingly silent. A silence that didn't bring peace, but rather exclusion. Conversations between them took place behind closed doors. I heard whispers, decisions being made without me, about spaces I still cleaned daily. Even my crocheting, that simple habit that made me feel alive, began to bother me. One day I heard my daughter-in-law say, "Those threads scattered all over the house are giving me agony." That pierced me like an arrow. I, who once decorated the rooms with my handmade quilts, was now seen as a mess. The truth is, even without direct words, the disrespect began to take shape in the details. It wasn't necessary to yell to hurt me. It was enough to ignore. All it took was that look that avoided mine, that lack of questions about my day, that forced kindness that only made the emotional distance between us more evident. And I remained there, trying not to get in the way, trying to fit into a space that no longer belonged to me. As if my own home had become foreign territory. I kept asking myself, when did I stop being welcome? What was the exact moment my presence became tolerated, not celebrated? But no matter how much my heart screamed, my mouth remained silent. Because we learn to endure. We learn to hold back our tears so as not to cause conflict, especially when it comes to family. And that's when vulnerability set in. A silent vulnerability, unseen by anyone, but one that gnaws at us from within. I felt increasingly invisible. Even decisions about the house began to be made without my input. One day I came home from the grocery store and my room looked different. They'd moved my furniture, moved the bed, donated a closet that belonged to my mother without even telling me. When I questioned him, Daniel responded with eerie calm. "It's to optimize the space." The word kept hammering in my head. Optimize. As if I were part of a piece of furniture that needed to be repositioned to make room for something more useful. It was then that I began to understand that something bigger was happening. It wasn't stress, as I kept telling myself to try to justify it. It was a silent decision to distance myself. A choice that had been slowly being made behind the scenes of our lives. With each small gesture, I felt the impact of a new exclusion. A declined invitation here, a slurred phrase there, an impatient look when I wanted to share something simple about my day. And so, without realizing it, I was being pushed out of my own family's story. The cruelest thing was knowing that all of this came from someone who once promised to care for me. And I believed. Because when you're a mother, you believe until the end. You believe even when there's no longer any evidence of affection, when hope begins to seem naive. But behind that hope was something no one could take from me. My memory. My truth. And one thing I knew. Love may not be reciprocated, but respect, that's not optional. That's a right. Still I continued to endure, hoping the next day would be different. That he'd wake up in a good mood. That he'd remember everything we'd been through. That he'd sit down with me for coffee like before. But the days passed, and the distance only grew. And I, already tired, began to see more clearly. Noticing the signs. Putting together the pieces of a puzzle that revealed something much deeper than a simple home renovation. Because deep down, everything was already being prepared. And what would come next would completely change the course of this story. It happened on a typical afternoon, one of those when everything seems to be going according to plan. I had just finished folding a pile of laundry, the scent of fresh coffee still lingering in the air. The sound of the kettle was still echoing when Daniel appeared in the living room, accompanied by his wife. They were both serious, but with that calm tone you recognize when something has been rehearsed. He asked me to sit down, said he wanted to talk to me kindly, that it was about the house and that he had an idea to improve our relationship. I sat down and listened. I tried not to resist, as I always did. "We're thinking about renovating the entire house, Mom." That's how it began. "It's a lot. Breaking and breaking. People coming and going. It's going to be stressful for you." I shook my head, trying to understand what he was saying so carefully. "We think it'd be best if you stayed away for a while, somewhere quieter, until everything is ready." His wife added with a restrained smile. "We've already thought of everything. It'll be quick. 2 weeks, tops." He held out an envelope with 500 reis and placed a packed suitcase beside me. "Ready." Even before the conversation. In that moment my mind froze. My body stood there, motionless, while everything inside me screamed. But outwardly I could only nod. It was as if I'd been expelled without anyone saying a word. And perhaps that was exactly the plan. A removal disguised as care. A cold decision wrapped in sweet words. I felt infantilized, invisible, diminished. They didn't ask if I had anywhere to go. They didn't ask if I was okay. They just offered me a pretty exit, with an undefined return date. I went to my room alone, suitcase in hand and my heart in pieces. I touched every object as if it were the last time. My wedding photo. The photo frame with Daniel still small, dressed as an astronaut. The quilt I'd made with my own hands, now folded and out of place. I tried to fit my story into that small space of luggage. And as I did so, one question wouldn't leave my mind. Since when did I become someone to be removed? That wasn't just a practical decision. It was a revelation. Turning point. A hidden truth I still didn't want to accept. They didn't want me there anymore. The renovation was just an excuse. A pretext that looked like a solution. And deep down something inside me already knew. But like so many mothers, I still insisted on giving them the benefit of the doubt. On thinking that maybe, just maybe, it really was out of care. Out of consideration. But there was one detail that bothered me deeply. Everything was already packed. The suitcase, the money counted, the lodging in a small room in the back of an acquaintance's house, who, get this, already knew I was coming. I kept thinking about how long it took them to plan this. How many secret conversations had taken place without me even suspecting. And this feeling of having been deceived so politely, with such calculation and control, hurt me more than if they had simply yelled at me and sent me away. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the emotional impact of being gently discarded. An elegant manipulation that made me doubt myself. Was I overreacting? Were they right? Was I really getting in the way? For days these questions lingered. And I, with my mindset shaped over the years by silences, sacrifices, and omissions, began to blame myself. I began to think that maybe it really was time to give them space. That maybe I was expecting too much. But there, alone in that borrowed room, I began to re-examine every detail. I began to reconstruct the timeline, to piece together the loose pieces. It was a difficult but revealing internal journey. Because when we're pushed outward, we're also forced to look inward. And inside me there was much more than sadness. There was memory, there was value, and there was a flame burning. I just needed to figure out what to do with it. It was then that I realized they had forgotten an important detail. The house, the one they wanted to renovate, was still in my name. The small room smelled of old dust and pent-up damp. The walls were thin, hastily painted, and the window barely let in any sunlight. It wasn't a place to live. It was a place to wait. And that's exactly what I did, wait. I waited for the phone to ring, a message to arrive, someone to knock on the door with a shy smile saying, "We missed you." But time passed, and all I received was silence. A harsh silence, one that screamed truths I still didn't want to hear. The woman who rented the space to me was simple and reserved. In the early days, she treated me with a certain warmth, but without any affection. I could tell she knew about the situation, but avoided getting involved. Perhaps she'd been instructed to do so. The feeling was clear. I was there like an object out of place, a box left in a corner, waiting to be collected. I tried to maintain some dignity. I washed my clothes by hand, organized the space, made coffee even if no one would join me. It was a way of remembering who I was, of not losing myself completely in the abandonment. Over time, I began to realize that the renovation story was nothing more than a facade. Literally, no builders showed up. No walls were torn down. The house remained intact, as if nothing had happened. One afternoon on impulse, I took the bus past my old home. The curtains were open, the garden mowed, Daniel's car in the garage. Everything was in the same place. Except me. That's when it truly hit me. I wasn't out because the house needed to change. I was out because they wanted me to cease existing inside. This realization brought me a strange mix of pain and clarity. It was like lifting a veil from our eyes. For so long we believe in the sweet versions of the people we love, because accepting the truth requires a strength we don't always have. But when the truth imposes itself, it drags everything with it. Memories, expectations, illusions. I was forced to face reality with my bare eyes, without a filter. And for the first time, I realized that abandoning them wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. Alone in that room, each day was an exercise in endurance. I silently relived the behind-the-scenes of my own story. I remembered how I built that house with every penny I saved, how I painted the walls with my own hands, how I carefully preserved every childhood photo of Daniel. That was my journey, my refuge. And now, it was occupied by people who acted as if I had never existed. The injustice of it all corroded me, but it didn't defeat me. Quite the contrary. A subtle but powerful transformation was beginning to emerge within me. It was during this time of isolation that a new mindset began to emerge. I didn't want revenge. I wanted respect. And I understood that if I didn't do anything, this story would end the way they planned, with me forgotten in a corner, while they went on with their lives as if I were a burden they'd left behind. It was then that I remembered something crucial. That property, that house. was still in my name. I'd never given the documents to anyone, a detail that, in their rush to get me out of the picture, they seemed to have forgotten. It was a simple suit, but it had a profound impact. And in that moment, a flame of decision began to ignite. Not out of pride but out of dignity. I could remain silent, accepting the role of an extra in my own life. Or I could act, firmly but without hatred, clearly but quietly, with awareness of my worth, my place, my story. The choice was made. The next day I took the bus downtown. I took with me the folder containing the house documents, which I'd always kept hidden, like someone protecting a part of their body. I entered the registry office with trembling hands, but with a firm heart. There, sitting at the cold table, I began something that even I didn't know where it would lead. But one thing was certain. I would no longer be a spectator to my own journey. It was on one of those muggy autumn afternoons, when time seems to stand still and the silence weighs heavily, that the revelation reached me. I was sitting on the sidewalk with a cup of lukewarm coffee in my hands, when the owner of the house, a soft-spoken woman with an observant gaze, struck me. "And the renovations, Mrs. Evelyn, are they finished yet?" I smiled awkwardly, as if trying to maintain a pretense, and shook my head. "It never started." She frowned, made a gesture of astonishment, and uttered a simple sentence, almost as if speaking to herself. "But at least the house is yours, right? It's still in your name, right?" That struck me like a bolt of lightning. My heart raced. Took me a few seconds to respond. At that moment, a dormant memory jolted awake. The document, the letterhead with my name in bold letters. A deed. I had never transferred the house to Daniel. I had never signed anything. It was as if that file had been tucked away somewhere in my mind, waiting to be retrieved at the right time. And there it was, the key to the whole story, a detail no one mentioned but which changed everything. I returned to the room, palms sweating. I rummaged through the old folder where I kept receipts, certificates, and old letters. And there it was, the original deed, intact. Evelyn Grace, owner. I reread that word so many times the letters began to jumble. But the meaning was clear. The house was still mine. Completely mine. There was no contract, no donation, no transfer. They had forgotten a crucial detail. A mistake that now became my only weapon. And I knew, I had to make a decision. Not for revenge but for justice. I spent days thinking about what to do. The decision weighed heavily. Because addressing this meant facing truths that still hurt. It meant accepting that my own son had taken me from a place that was mine, pretending it was for my own good. It meant understanding that it wasn't an emotional slip-up, but a well-planned move. Calculated withdrawal. And more than that, it meant admitting to myself that I could no longer wait to be recognized. I needed to act for myself. For the woman I had been. For the woman I still was. This shift in mindset was almost physical. I felt it in my body. It was as if something inside me was reorganizing itself. As if the vulnerability that had previously paralyzed me now pushed me forward. I was no longer afraid. Had clarity. And with that clarity, I took a bus to the city registry office. With every kilometer, images came like flashes. The day Daniel was born, the sleepless nights, the birthdays I'd prepared with such care. And, on top of it all, the coldness with which he removed me from his own story. It was too much weight to carry in silence. So I went. I entered the registry office with slow but steady steps. The clerk asked me how she could help. I responded with a tone that even surprised me. "I want to know what my rights are to a property that's still in my name." She looked at me, took the information, entered it into the system. She confirmed, "You're the sole owner." It wasn't news, but hearing it out loud gave me a kind of relief I didn't even know I needed. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't exaggerating. The truth was there, clear on paper before me. I requested an updated copy. I took it with me like someone carrying a silent trophy. And that day, I returned to the back room with a new attitude. I knew that document was more than a deed. It was a symbol. A way to reclaim my narrative. To show not to the world but to myself that I still had value, that I could still make decisions, that my story wouldn't end with a 500 real envelope and a packed suitcase. Of course, I still didn't know exactly what I would do. Sell, rent, return. The options ran through my head like a jigsaw puzzle with no final image. But what mattered at that moment was knowing I had a choice. That the power was no longer in the hands of those who discarded me. It was back with me. It was the beginning of a new journey. A silent journey, made of inner revelations and decisions that would change everything. Because sometimes, the most profound transformation doesn't come from shouting or confrontation. It comes from the calm certainty of someone who has suffered too much, and has decided they will no longer accept less than they deserve. That paper in my hands wasn't just a property deed. It was the reflection of my entire story. Every line, every piece of information recorded there carried the weight of a dedicated life, a journey made of sacrifices and affections. It was silent proof that, despite everything, I was still there, present, capable, and more than that, master of my own story. The feeling that washed over me wasn't one of victory, it was one of reunion. It was as if I was finally looking at myself with the clarity that pain had stolen. And in that moment, a certainty struck me. No one will write my end for me. And you know, if anything in this story has ever revolted you, if at any point you felt anger, sadness, or even remembered something you experienced, leave it in the comments. Sometimes, we spend years silently harboring a wound that only begins to heal when it finds a space to be heard. And this space here is ours. I read every word you leave. I feel moved, I recognize myself, I feel stronger. Because when we share, we transform pain into connection. If this content touched you in any way, if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, valued, heard, click the like button. It may seem like a small gesture, but it helps this video reach others who also need this conversation. People who may be going through exactly this right now and feel alone. And if you feel this kind of story speaks to you, if you want to continue following this journey and many others to come, subscribe to the channel. It's your support that keeps this space going. And each new subscription is like an outstretched hand saying, I see it too. Feel it too. I'm here too. Because no one should go through this kind of situation thinking they're alone. And sometimes, all we need is a story told truthfully to remind us we're not alone. That's what moves me. And that's what gives me the courage to keep telling what's yet to come. Selling that house was one of the quietest and, at the same time, loudest acts of my life. There were no arguments, no confrontations, no bitter words. Just decisions. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I'd already proven myself throughout my life. Every morning I woke up early to go to work. Every time I didn't buy something for myself so I could give it to my son. Every time I choked back tears to keep the peace. All of this already said more about me than any excuse could say now. The sale process was discreet. I did everything with the calm of someone who has learned, the hard way, to live with dignity even when the world tries to take it away from us. I signed the papers with steady hands, and didn't let any emotion stop me from moving forward. It was like ripping an old bandage off an open wound. It hurts, but it's necessary. That house, as much as it had been the stage for so many good memories, had also become a symbol of my exclusion. It was the scene of my annihilation. And I knew that to start over, I needed to leave it behind. With the money from the sale, I bought a small apartment, but with light streaming through the windows and silence in the right corners. A place of my own where I could walk barefoot, crochet freely, and make my own coffee without hearing impatient sighs. A place where no one told me to be quiet, or asked me to disappear for a while. A place where the transformation that truly took place was within me. It was in the way I saw myself, how I treated myself, how I finally decided to put myself first. I left no notices, no phone calls, just a note, written in the same handwriting I once wrote sweet little notes in my son's lunch. It contained just a few words. The renovation was done. But to me, because that's what they needed to understand, if anyone changed in that story, it wasn't the house. It was me. And maybe one day they'll realize the impact of that transformation. Maybe not. but it's no longer mine. For a long time I dreamed of reconciliation, of an apology, of recognition, however belated. But in this new phase of my journey, I realized that justice doesn't always come the way we expect. Sometimes it comes with silence, with an absence that speaks, with an attitude that doesn't need an audience. And that was my choice. Not to shout, not to expose, not to confront, just to leave the scene with my head held high, taking with me the one thing no one can ever take from me: my story. The hidden truth behind all this is that, often, those who hurt us most aren't our enemies. They're those we love most. And dealing with this requires a strength we don't know we have until we have to use it. It's easy to react with anger. It's difficult to maintain dignity when your heart is broken. But there's a kind of power that comes precisely from self-control, from the awareness of who you've become. And it was this awareness that guided me this far. Every step I've taken since that note has been with the goal of not losing myself. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about rescuing myself, repositioning myself in the world. Accepting that, even after everything, I was still capable of making choices with clarity, firmness, and respect, including respect for myself. This shift in mindset was like waking up from a long, exhausting dream. As if suddenly, I saw clearly everything I'd refused to see for years. And when we awaken like that, there's no going back. Some people ask if I regret leaving without saying anything, not demanding anything, not confronting anyone. But what they don't understand is that my departure was a confrontation, that my absence was the loudest message I could have given. Because sometimes, silence teaches what shouting can't. And justice, when delivered with dignity, has an even greater impact. It's like a whisper that echoes within the conscience of those who need to hear it. Moved on. And, over time, that small apartment filled with life. New plants, new colors, new habits. I woke up without fear of disturbing anyone, made plans without asking permission. I finally became the owner not only of a property, but of myself. And that, for someone who's been treated like a burden, is a form of rebirth. A kind of freedom you can't see but you can feel. And I knew that this new version of me still had much to reveal. It had been months of absolute silence. No messages, no calls, no sign of life. The same son who had driven me away with gentle, yet stone-cold words had now completely disappeared. And, honestly, I no longer expected anything. I had stopped counting the days, waiting for justifications or explanations. I had finally understood that certain absences are not oversights. They are choices. And learning to respect this emptiness was one of the most difficult, yet also most liberating steps of my journey. Life went on. My own pace. Simple, quiet, but full of small victories. The apartment began to feel like home. I relearned how to live alone. Not with sadness, but with purpose. I rediscovered the pleasure of cooking just for myself, of going for walks at any time, of putting on music and dancing slowly around the living room. That dull woman who once left with a suitcase in hand and a shattered soul no longer existed. In her place was someone renewed, still bearing deep scars, but with a new vision of herself and what truly matters. It was a Sunday morning, one of those when we wake up with a light heart, that the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. There was no one to wait for. When I opened the door, it took me a few seconds to recognize the man before me. He was haggard, thin, with sunken eyes. But what caught my attention most was the way he avoided looking at me. Daniel, my son. The one who called me queen and then treated me like a nuisance. There, standing at my door. He was no longer the confident man who once ruled the house. He was broken, silent, holding back tears. Took a while, but he spoke. His voice was broken, his face was ashamed. He said he regretted it. That his life had been turned upside down. That he was in debt, that his wife had left, that his friends had disappeared. That he'd lost his job, his car, his comforts. And that now he had nowhere to live. "Mom," he said in a tone I hadn't heard in a long time. "I need help. Can I stay here with you for a while?" That sentence reverberated within me like an echo of everything I'd experienced in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I didn't feel angry. In that moment, all that existed within me was a clarity so serene it was almost frightening. I looked into his eyes, for the first time in a long time, and saw him as he truly was. Not the man who discarded me, but the lost boy who couldn't handle his own journey. But seeing this doesn't mean forgetting what he did. Forgiveness, when it exists, doesn't erase memory. And dignity, that's not negotiable. I took a deep breath and simply said, "As you sow, so shall you reap, my son." It wasn't with resentment. It was with truth. Because that's the law of life. We reap what we sow. And he, in that moment, was simply facing his own fruits. That sentence wasn't a punishment. It was an acknowledgement. Consequence. I knew he expected a different kind of response. Perhaps an immediate welcome, a desperate hug, something like, "Sure, come in, it's your house." But that wasn't my truth anymore. And I wasn't going to abandon myself to save anyone. In that moment, there was a thick silence between us. A silence that said more than any speech. He lowered his eyes, took a deep breath, and said he understood. That perhaps it was too late. That only now could he see all he had done. And I saw real pain there. A pain that came not from the loss of possessions, but from the recognition of one's own failure. It wasn't just regret. It was awareness. And that somehow touched me. I didn't say anything else. I just closed the door carefully. I returned to my couch, sat calmly, and stared out the window. For a few minutes, I stood there in silence, watching the sky. A clear blue sky, as if telling me, "You are where you're supposed to be." And there, in that moment, I understood that my journey was no longer about the past. It was about everything I still had to experience. Because even after everything, life still called me to move on. And within me there was something new blossoming. A strength that didn't scream, but pulsed steadily. A certainty that self-love, when it finally arrives, never leaves. These days, I wake up to the light streaming through the window, not with the burden of needing to please someone. I wake up unhurriedly, without that feeling of always being in the way, of taking up too much space. I get up, put my coffee on, open the window, and let the world in lightly. You know what's most curious? The house is small, but it's as if it's the exact size of my peace. Nothing is left over. Nothing is missing. And finally, I understood that this, too, is freedom. Living in a place that welcomes you instead of silently excluding you. Some days, I bake a cake and leave it at the door for my neighbor, who always greets me with a genuine smile. Other days, I spend hours reading on the porch, listening to the street voices as if listening to a concert. Sometimes, I sit alone to watch a soap opera and find myself laughing out loud, as if someone were there with me. And, in a way, they are. I am with myself. And that, for someone who has spent a lifetime trying to be seen by others, is one of the greatest victories one can achieve. Of course, not everything is rosy. There are days when memories return like a strong wind, disrupting what I thought was already resolved. There are mornings when the silence weighs more heavily, when Daniel's absence hurts, not because of what he didn't do now, but because of what he failed to do over the years. But even in those moments, I can take a deep breath and remember. I survived. And not just survived, I was reborn. The difference is enormous. Because to survive is to resist. To be reborn is to choose to live in a new way. I learned over time that true love doesn't demand sacrifice of our essence. True love doesn't demand silence when the soul cries out, doesn't hide behind excuses disguised as care, doesn't diminish the other to feel in control. I spent much of my life believing it was my obligation to endure, that it was part of a mother's role to endure until the end, even if the end came disguised as help. But this idea robbed me of years of peace. And understanding this changed everything. Today I look in the mirror with a different perspective. Kinder, firmer one. I see a woman who cried, who fell, who was humiliated, but who chose to get up without stepping on anyone. I see someone who had the courage to change her own story, even when everyone expected her to remain silent. And above all, I see someone who learned to love herself calmly, without rushing to heal, but with a willingness to not put it off. The transformation that happened in me didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process, made up of small daily decisions. One of them was to stop apologizing for existing. Another was understanding that setting limits isn't selfish, but rather emotional survival. And one of the hardest, accepting that some people only learn when life teaches them. Not with anger but with awareness. Because time is responsible for showing what words can no longer explain. The impact of all this still resonates. Some people see me today and say I look lighter, stronger, more alive. And I smile because I know it's true. Pain shaped me, but I chose the shape. And that choice made all the difference. The difference between being merely a consequence of the wounds or being the author of my own new beginning. Sometimes I wonder if Daniel thinks about me. If he remembers the house. If he revisits the moments he removed me from the scene like someone removing an antique piece of furniture. And if that still weighs on him. But I don't dwell on that question for long. Because today, my energy no longer goes to where it hurts. It goes to where it heals. It goes to the cake I bake with love, the embroidery I do slowly, the coffee I drink, gazing at the sky and giving thanks. Not for everything I've experienced, but for everything I've overcome. And for knowing deep down that this story isn't over yet. Because as long as we breathe truly, there are always new chapters waiting to be written. And what if you've also felt like life has pushed you into a corner? If you've ever looked in the mirror and seen a tired reflection, not on the outside, but on the inside, know that I understand. I truly understand. Because when we give too much of ourselves, for too long without even realizing it, we fade a little each day. We get used to being forgotten, ignored, left for later. It starts with a silence here, a lack of attention there. And suddenly you're no longer invited to the dinner table. You're no longer consulted in decisions. You're no longer heard. And before you know it, you've become practically a piece of furniture in your own home. Present but invisible. Maybe you've been through this too. Maybe you're going through it now. Maybe someone made you believe that aging means becoming useless, that your time is up, that your feelings no longer matter. And if that's the case, let me tell you something I learned the hard way. That's a lie. Complete lie. Our existence never loses its value. Our story never loses its weight. And our love, the love we gave completely, doesn't diminish us. Quite the opposite. It's proof of our strength. I needed to lose almost everything to understand this. I needed to be removed from the home I helped build, silenced within a family I created, to see what was hidden, that my dignity didn't depend on anyone's approval, that my story had value, even when no one else seemed to want to hear it. It was there, in the depths of abandonment, that I discovered the value of starting over. Not with anger but with courage. Not to prove anything but to reconnect with what was always within me. And this rediscovery of myself wasn't immediate. It came gradually with each small choice. When I decided I would eat well even if I was alone. When I started crocheting again, even without anyone asking. When I chose songs that reminded me of who I was before I was forgotten. When I cooked just for myself and savored the dish as if honoring myself. And most importantly, when I looked at my story without shame, without guilt, and said, "This is me too. This pain also made me grow." So, if you're experiencing a similar moment, feeling forgotten, discarded, invisible, please don't think it's too late. There is time, yes, to turn things around. To look in the mirror and say, "I'm still here." Maybe the pain has left its mark. Maybe the silence has screamed loudly inside your home. But believe me, life still has new chapters in store for you. And you know what's most beautiful? These chapters don't depend on anyone but you. All it takes is a decision, change of perspective, a small but sincere step toward your own truth. And I'm not saying it's easy. It's not. The path to transformation is paved with stumbles, setbacks, days when you feel like giving up. But it's also paved with quiet achievements, peace in the details, and inner discoveries that no one can steal. It was like that for me. And it can be like that for you too. Doesn't matter how old you are. The heart doesn't follow a calendar. And dignity. Dignity is a decision that begins within. So if this story touched you, if any part of it resonated with you, leave a "I'm with you until the end" comment below. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. And your presence here, even if silent, is part of something bigger. Because each comment is like a hug, a bridge between people who thought they were alone but aren't. And that's what keeps this space alive. That's what transforms a video into something truly impactful. If you haven't enjoyed this content yet, do so now. It may seem like just a click, but it helps this message reach further, reaching other women who may be going through what you went through. And if you want to continue following these stories, reflecting together, and growing stronger, subscribe to the channel. This is more than a video. It's a space for listening, healing, and transformation. Because in the end, what you don't learn through love, life teaches you through pain. But dignity, that, my dear, no one can take away. And it begins when you pick yourself up off the ground and say, with all your heart, "This story is still mine." 'Cause it is. And you know, maybe it's exactly now that your turning point begins. Because when a woman understands her own worth, there's no age, no past, no rejection that can hold back the magnitude of the new beginning that awaits her. If you've made it this far, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for following me through this story. It's good to know that on the other side there's someone who listens, feels, and shares this journey with me. If this video touched something deep inside you, if at any point you saw yourself in my words, leave a comment below. This message was for me. Because it's important to know that these stories are reaching those who truly need to hear them. And if this kind of conversation resonates with you, if it helps you, comforts you, or simply keeps you company, subscribe to the channel. That's what keeps this space alive. Real people with real stories, connecting unhurriedly, without judgment, with truth. Enjoy and leave a like too if this touched you in any way. This shows me that this path makes sense and that we should continue together. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click and continue with me there. Sometimes one story opens the door to another, and we just need to take the next step.